The cemetery lay silent under the October morning sun, white drapes of the funeral tent billowing softly in the Philadelphia breeze. 200 mourners dressed in black filled the rows of folding chairs, their faces heavy with the particular grief reserved for those who die too young, too suddenly, too rich. The gold-sheen casket rested beside the open grave, and beneath it, a layer of fresh cement waited like a promise of permanence. Inside that casket, Victoria Hawthorne lay motionless. Her skin held the pallor of wax, her lips tinged faintly blue. Cotton plugs filled her nostrils. The CEO of Hawthorne Medical, Pennsylvania's leading medical technology empire, appeared every inch the corpse that Dr. Nathan Rivers had certified her to be 72 hours earlier. Richard Hawthorne stood beside the casket, a white handkerchief folded neatly in his hand. Tears shimmered in his eyes. The perfect performance of devastation. He'd practiced this moment in mirrors, in empty rooms, in the shower where no one could hear him rehearsing grief. Now, under the scrutiny of Philadelphia's elite, he delivered it flawlessly. Pastor Samuel Green cleared his throat, preparing to offer the final prayer. The two cemetery workers stepped forward, gloved hands reaching for the casket's brass handles. In moments, Victoria Hawthorne would descend into the earth, and the cement would seal her there forever. Then a voice tore through the morning like thunder. "Stop! Don't bury her! She's still alive!" Every head turned at once. Phones lifted, capturing the disruption. At the back of the crowd, a man in a worn blue work uniform pushed through the mourners, his movements urgent but controlled. His beard grew unkempt around his jaw, his hair needed cutting, but his eyes burned with absolute clarity. The badge clipped to his chest pocket read, M. Donovan, Operations Manager. Marcus Donovan pointed straight at Victoria, his hands steady despite the trembling that ran through his shoulders. "She's not dead. I'm telling you right now, don't bury that woman." "Who is he?" someone whispered, phone already recording. "Is that the groundskeeper?" another voice murmured. "Security!" Richard's voice cracked across the gathering, sharp with panic masked as outrage. Two guards in dark suits moved to intercept Mark, but he sidestepped them with surprising agility, continuing forward. The wind caught the hem of his uniform like wings as he stopped at the edge of the carpeted platform where the casket rested. He turned to face the entire assembly, and something in his bearing, the set of his shoulders, the directness of his gaze, made people hesitate. "My name is Marcus Donovan." His breath came unsteady, but his voice carried clear. "I manage operations for this cemetery, but before that, I spent 15 years as a senior biomedical engineer with the FDA. I specialized in marine toxins research." He pointed again at Victoria, his gesture firm. "This woman was poisoned with tetrodotoxin, a paralytic compound derived from pufferfish. In low doses, it mimics death, slows the heartbeat to nearly nothing, drops body temperature, freezes muscle function. Without advanced equipment, it's easily mistaken for actual death." A ripple of shock moved through the crowd like wind across water. "That's insane!" Richard stepped forward, his mask of grief cracking into something harder. "Security, remove this lunatic immediately!" Dr. Nathan Rivers emerged from the crowd, his stethoscope still tucked in his pocket from the viewing. "I examined Mrs. Hawthorne thoroughly. She passed from cardiac arrest. This is a man trying to prevent a murder." Mark's voice cut through the doctor's stammering. He looked directly at Rivers, and recognition flickered between them. "Dr. Rivers, Victoria Hawthorne built you a hospital wing. She bought you that car you drive. She trusted you with her life." The words landed like stones in still water. "And you signed her death certificate knowing she was still alive." Rivers' face went white. Richard lunged forward, but found his path blocked by Grace Montgomery, Victoria's aunt, who had risen from her front row seat. At 68, Grace carried herself with the kind of steel that old money and older pain forged in a person. "Let him speak." Grace's voice, though quiet, commanded attention. She turned to Mark. "If there is even the smallest possibility, we must try. What do we lose?" Sarah Chen, a board member of Hawthorne Medical, stood as well. Her sharp eyes moved from Mark to Richard to the casket. "Mrs. Montgomery is right. If he's wrong, nothing changes. But if he's right," she let the implication hang. "This is absurd." First tried again, his hands shaking visibly now. You cannot put unknown substances into unknown? Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out a small brown vial, holding it up for all to see. This is a prescription mixture of atropine sulfate and neostigmine methyl sulfate, standard antidote for paralytic toxin exposure. I obtained it Friday from Dr. Robert Chen at Johns Hopkins Toxicology Department. Here's the pharmacy label. Here are my FDA credentials. He held up a worn leather ID case. The crowd pressed forward, phones capturing everything. The moment already going viral on networks none of them could see yet. Richard's face had gone from pale to flushed, sweat beading along his hairline despite the cool October air. She's my wife. I will not allow what? Grace's voice sharpened. Allow us to verify whether she's truly gone. What husband would refuse that? Pastor Green lowered his Bible, his own doubt visible now. Perhaps we should check more carefully. It costs us nothing. The two cemetery workers exchanged glances, then stepped back from the casket. Mark moved forward and Grace followed, with Sarah Chen close behind. Together they helped lift Victoria's upper body slightly, propping her head at an angle. Up close, Victoria looked merely asleep. Her eyelashes cast long shadows across her cheeks, her features smooth and unmarked by the violence of death. Please remove the cotton plugs, Mark said softly. Grace's hands trembled, but held steady as she pulled the cotton free from Victoria's nostrils. The air seemed to shift, as if the morning itself held its breath. Mark reached again into his pocket and produced the brown vial. He held it up, turning it slowly so the light caught the liquid inside. The tetrodotoxin blocks sodium channels in nerve cells. It doesn't kill immediately, it paralyzes. Victims remain conscious but appear dead. Without this antidote, she'll die within hours from respiratory failure. He twisted the cap off and drew liquid into the dropper. Atropine increases heart rate, neostigmine reverses the paralysis. Together they can pull someone back from the edge. Don't you dare! Richard's shout fractured into something raw and desperate. He started forward, but two board members stepped between him and the casket. Thompson, elderly but solid. Bradford, younger but built like a linebacker. Let him try, Thompson said, his eyes never leaving Richard's face. Something had shifted in the old man's expression, suspicion taking root where trust had been. Mark knelt beside the casket. His calloused hands, rough from maintenance work and years of hardship, moved with surprising gentleness as he tilted Victoria's head back slightly. Please help me open her mouth. Grace leaned down, using her fingers to part Victoria's lips with the tenderness of someone handling something precious and broken. The young man in the black suit, someone's son, someone's assistant, lifted Victoria's shoulders higher. Mark bent close, the dropper poised above Victoria's parted lips. His voice dropped to a whisper, almost a prayer. Come back, ma'am. It's not your time yet. He squeezed gently. A single clear droplet fell, landing on Victoria's tongue. No one breathed. Not a single leaf stirred. The cemetery might have been carved from stone. Every person frozen in this impossible moment. Mark counted silently, his lips moving. 1, 2, 3. Nothing. 4, 5. A cold gust swept through, making the white drapes snap and billow. Someone in the crowd whispered a prayer. 6. Mark's hand began to shake. He lifted the dropper again, preparing another dose. Don't you? Richard's scream died in his throat as he suddenly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something metallic that caught the sunlight. A syringe. Stay back. Richard's eyes had gone wild, spittle flying with each word. She was supposed to go. She was supposed to stay dead. 2 security guards finally moved, tackling Richard as he tried to rush the casket. The syringe flew from his hand, clattering against the cement pad with a sound like breaking glass. Grace lunged forward and grabbed it before anyone else could react, holding it up to the light with horror dawning across her face. What is this, Richard? Her voice could have cut steel. What's in this syringe? But Mark had already released the second drop, his focus absolute despite the chaos erupting around him. The droplet fell in what felt like slow motion, suspended between heaven and earth, between death and life. It touched Victoria's tongue, and in that instant, that hair's breadth moment between one heartbeat and the next, A tiny sound escaped from Victoria's chest, so faint it could have been wind or imagination or the whisper of hope itself. Then her throat convulsed. Her lips parted wider. A cough, weak, rattling, but undeniably real, burst from her lungs. The cemetery exploded into chaos. Screams and cheers and prayers all crashed together in a wave of sound that rolled across the manicured lawns and marble headstones. Phones tilted in every direction, recording a resurrection that no one would believe without video proof. Victoria's hand twitched, her fingers curled. Her eyelids fluttered like butterfly wings fighting toward light. Mark leaned closer, his eyes blazing with something between triumph and terror. "She's coming back. I told you, she's alive." Grace grabbed Victoria's wrist, her face transforming from grief to wonder in the space of a heartbeat. "She's warm. Oh God, she's warm again." A woman in the crowd collapsed to her knees, sobbing and praying in Spanish. Others stood frozen, unable to process what their eyes reported. The impossible made manifest. Victoria's chest rose and fell. Shallow breaths, irregular, but breaths nonetheless. Her eyelids continued to flutter, then slowly opened. Confusion and fear swam in those eyes. The terror of someone waking in a coffin, surrounded by mourners. "Why?" The word came out as barely a whisper, hoarse and broken. Victoria's gaze drifted across the faces above her, strangers and loved ones blurring together until they landed on the man kneeling beside her. Recognition flickered. You're the man from the cemetery. You asked about the security cameras." Mark's throat worked, words failing him for a moment. Then he managed, "Easy, Mrs. Hawthorne. You're safe now." But Victoria's eyes had already moved past him, finding Richard where the guards held him. Her voice gained strength, fueled by something deeper than oxygen. "Richard, what did you do?" The crowd's noise peaked again, then fell away to shocked whispers as Richard began to struggle against his captors with renewed violence. No, she was supposed to be gone. The plan." His words tumbled out in fragments, the careful performance shattered beyond repair. "She was supposed to stay dead." Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Someone had called 911, though no one could say exactly when. Police cruisers and an ambulance rolled through the cemetery gates, lights flashing red and blue across the white marble monuments. Dr. Rivers had fallen to his knees beside the casket, his face buried in his hands. "I'm sorry. God forgive me. I'm so sorry." Mark caught Victoria as she tried to sit up, her muscles still weak from 3 days of paralysis. "Slow. You need to take it slow. Your body's been through hell." She looked at him again, really looked, and something passed between them. Recognition of a different sort. The recognition of two people who'd both faced death and somehow survived. "Thank you." The words barely made sound, but her eyes said everything her voice couldn't. The first police officer reached the platform, his hand on his weapon but his face showing nothing but confusion. "Someone want to tell me what's happening here?" "Attempted murder." Grace's voice rang clear as she held up the syringe. "This man," she gestured at Richard with barely contained fury, "tried to bury his wife alive. This man," now she indicated Mark, "saved her life." The officer's gaze moved from the syringe to Victoria sitting up in her casket to Richard being restrained by security. His training probably hadn't covered resurrections at funerals. "Ma'am, are you Victoria Hawthorne?" "I am." Victoria's voice grew stronger with each word, as if language itself was pulling her back into the world of the living. "And I want that man arrested. I want him arrested right now." Richard screamed then, a sound of pure rage stripped of all pretense. "This isn't fair. The company should be mine. I earned it. You deserve a cell." Victoria cut through his tantrum with the cold precision of a CEO who'd built an empire from nothing. "And you're going to get one." The paramedics arrived with a stretcher and equipment, their professional calm barely masking their shock at the situation. One of them, a woman in her 30s with kind eyes, knelt beside the casket and began checking Victoria's vitals while her partner radioed for additional support. BP is low but stable, pulse is weak and thready, pupils responsive but sluggish. She looked at Mark. "Sir, what did you give her?" "Atropine 0.5 milligrams and neostigmine 2 milligrams. She was poisoned with tetrodotoxin approximately 72 hours ago. I'm a biomedical engineer, FDA Toxicology Division, 15 years. Mark's voice had slipped into professional mode, delivering information with the precision of someone who'd briefed medical teams before. She'll need continuous respiratory monitoring for the next 48 hours. The paralysis reverses slowly. The paramedic's eyebrows rose. You're a doctor? Engineer, but I know this toxin better than most physicians. Something dark crossed his face. I spent 7 years studying it. Victoria reached out suddenly and gripped Mark's hand. Her fingers felt cold but growing warmer. Don't leave, please. I need... She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't have to. I'm not going anywhere. Mark's voice held the weight of a vow. The police had Richard in handcuffs now, reading him his rights while he continued to scream denials and accusations. Dr. Rivers stood under separate custody, his lawyer already on the phone, but the doctor wasn't fighting. He stood silent, tears streaming down his face. The picture of a man watching his entire life collapse. Detective James Morrison of the Philadelphia PD arrived as they were loading Victoria onto the stretcher. He was 45, grizzled, with the kind of face that had seen too much and believed too little. But even he stopped short at the scene before him, a woman being lifted from her own casket while her husband was led away in cuffs. Someone better start explaining. Morrison's voice carried the exhaustion of a long career. And it better be good. Grace stepped forward. Detective, my niece was the victim of attempted murder. This man, she gestured at Mark, recognized the signs of poisoning and intervened before she could be buried alive. Morrison's eyes narrowed as he took in Mark's worn uniform and unkempt appearance. And you are? Marcus Donovan. I manage cemetery operations here. Mark met the detective's skeptical gaze without flinching. I'm also a former FDA senior biomedical engineer. I recognize the symptoms because I spent years researching marine toxins. Convenient. Morrison's tone suggested anything but belief in convenience. 3 nights ago, I was doing security rounds. Wednesday, October 4th, around 11 p.m., I saw a black Mercedes parked by the maintenance gate. License plate RHH 2019. I heard 2 men arguing. Mark's voice never wavered. One voice younger said, the toxin worked perfectly. She's cooling down now. Tomorrow we bury her fast, before anyone questions it. The other voice, older, said, what if someone demands an autopsy? First voice answered, who would? I'm her husband. I'll refuse, and you're signing natural causes. Morrison pulled out a notepad, suddenly much more interested. You recognize these voices? I recognize the first voice from news interviews. Richard Hawthorne. Mark nodded toward the handcuffed man still screaming in the back of a police cruiser. I didn't know the second voice belonged to Dr. Rivers until I saw him at the funeral today. Dr. Rivers had gone completely silent now, his face ashen. The fight had drained out of him entirely. Why didn't you call the police? Morrison asked the question everyone was thinking. And tell you what, I overheard a conversation that could be interpreted multiple ways. Victoria Hawthorne wasn't legally dead yet. No crime had been committed. By the time you investigated and found evidence, if you found evidence, she'd be in the ground. Mark's jaw tightened. That cement sets fast, detective. Once she was down there, she'd have died from respiratory failure within hours. I couldn't take that risk. So you obtained an antidote and waited. Morrison's tone had shifted slightly, less skeptical now. That's either very smart or very suspicious. It's what anyone with the knowledge and means should do when they see evil about to win. Mark didn't flinch from the detective's scrutiny. I called a colleague at Johns Hopkins Thursday morning, Dr. Robert Chen, Toxicology Department. I explained what I'd overheard and my concerns about tetrodotoxin poisoning. He agreed to help based on my expertise. And you just happened to have that expertise. I spent 15 years building that expertise, detective. Every day, every paper, every lab accident I investigated. Yes, I had the knowledge, and when I needed it most, I used it. Something broke in Mark's voice. I failed to save someone I loved once before. I wasn't going to fail again. Morrison studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. We'll need a full statement from everyone. He gestured at the scene, the casket, the grave, the cement, the crowd of witnesses. This is going to be one hell of a case. The ambulance pulled away with Victoria inside, Grace accompanying her. Mark had started to follow when Morrison's hand landed on his shoulder. Mr. Donovan, I'm going to need you to come to the station. We have a lot of questions. I'll answer all of them. Mark glanced at the departing ambulance. But first, I need to make sure she's stable. She may experience secondary symptoms, respiratory depression, cardiac arrhythmias. I'm the only one here who knows the full toxicology profile. Morrison hesitated, then pulled out his card. Penn Presbyterian. I'll meet you there in 2 hours. Don't make me regret this. You won't. The cemetery slowly emptied as police secured the scene and took initial statements. News vans arrived within 15 minutes, having picked up the story from viral videos already spreading across social media. The funeral of the year had become the resurrection of the century. Pastor Green stood by the empty casket, staring at it as if trying to reconcile reality with his theology. In 40 years of ministry, he said to no one in particular, I've never seen anything like this. Tom Bradley, the cemetery's maintenance supervisor and Mark's closest friend among the staff, appeared at Mark's elbow. At 55, Tom had the build of someone who'd spent his life working with his hands, and the eyes of someone who'd learned not to judge. You did good, Mark. Tom's voice was quiet, meant only for his friend. I always knew there was more to you than the rest of them saw. I just did what needed doing. Most people don't. That's what makes it count. Tom clapped him once on the shoulder. Go, make sure she's okay. I'll handle things here. Mark nodded, grateful beyond words. He'd spent a year working alongside Tom, and in that time the older man had never once asked about Mark's past, never pushed for explanations about the haunted look that sometimes crossed Mark's face. Tom had simply offered friendship when Mark had nothing else. The drive to Penn Presbyterian took 20 minutes through Philadelphia traffic. Mark rode in his truck, a 15-year-old Ford that barely passed inspection, following the ambulance's route. His hands shook on the steering wheel now that the adrenaline was fading. He'd done it. He'd actually pulled it off. Victoria Hawthorne was alive, but the cost of that knowledge sat heavy in his chest. Sophie. His daughter would have been 17 now. Would she have been proud of him? Or would she have seen this as just another example of her father doing too little, too late? The hospital emergency entrance buzzed with activity. Mark found Victoria in a curtained bay, monitors beeping steadily as nurses worked around her. Grace sat in a plastic chair, her elegant dress incongruous in the harsh fluorescent lighting. She looked up when Mark entered, and he saw the full weight of the day in her eyes. They say she'll be fine. Grace's voice cracked slightly. Thanks to you. Thanks to luck in timing. Mark approached the bed carefully. Victoria's eyes were closed now, her chest rising and falling more regularly. Color had started to return to her cheeks. She's strong. She is, always has been. Grace studied him with the shrewd gaze of someone who'd learned to read people through decades of Philadelphia society. Who are you really, Marcus Donovan? Just someone who was in the right place at the right time. You're lying. No accusation in her tone, just statement of fact. Good men who tell the truth don't end up working cemetery maintenance with an MIT education and 15 years at the FDA. Mark's head snapped around. How did you? I made some calls while we waited for the ambulance. You're not hard to research once someone knows where to look. Grace's expression softened. Sophie Donovan, your daughter, 7 years old when she passed, congenital heart defect. The name hit Mark like a fist. He had to close his eyes, had to breathe through the sudden constriction in his chest. I'm sorry, Grace's voice held genuine compassion, but I needed to know who saved my niece. And now I understand why you couldn't let her die. I don't want Victoria to know. The words came out harsh. She doesn't need my baggage. She'll want to thank you properly. You saved her life. I did what anyone with the knowledge should have done. That's all. Mark turned toward the door. Detective Morrison will be here soon. She should rest while she can. But Victoria's eyes had opened. She'd been listening, though how much she'd heard, Mark couldn't tell. Her gaze found his across the small space, and something in that look made him freeze. Stay. Her voice was stronger now, no longer the whisper of someone pulled from death's edge. Please, I need to understand what happened. Mark wanted to refuse, wanted to slip away into anonymity, back to his small apartment and his maintenance duties and his quiet, guilt-ridden existence. But the plea in her eyes, the same desperation he'd seen in mirrors for years, kept him rooted. "What do you remember?" he asked instead. "Everything." The word came out heavy with horror. "I remember the dinner Richard brought me Wednesday night, the seafood pasta from Giovanni's. I remember feeling strange within the hour, tingling in my lips, my fingers going numb. I thought it was stress. I've been working long hours on the merger." Her hands clenched the hospital blanket. "Richard told me to lie down, said he'd call Dr. Rivers. I couldn't move, Che, then, couldn't speak. But I was conscious, completely aware." Her voice began to shake. "I heard everything. Richard asking Rivers how long it would take. Rivers saying 12 to 16 hours, then they'd certify me. I heard Richard ask if I might wake up. Rivers said not with that dose." Tears slipped down her cheeks now. "I screamed inside. Nothing came out. They left me there alone, paralyzed, waiting to die." Grace gripped her niece's hand, her own face wet. "Oh, sweetheart. When they put me in the casket, I felt it. The satin lining, the smell of roses. I heard every word at the viewing. Richard crying, people consoling him. He played it perfectly." Victoria's gaze locked on Mark again. "Then at the cemetery, I heard you. Stop, don't bury her. I couldn't see clearly, couldn't focus, but I heard you fighting for me when no one else would." "You heard him tell them you were poisoned?" Grace asked. "Fragments. The paralysis was affecting my hearing too, everything fading in and out. But I heard enough." Victoria took a shaky breath. "Then I felt the drops, the bitterness on my tongue, warmth spreading like fire through my veins, my fingers starting to move, and light, so much light after 3 days of being trapped in darkness." She looked at Mark with an intensity that made him want to flee. "You gave me back my life. How can I ever repay that? You don't owe me anything." The words came automatically, a shield against the gratitude he didn't feel he deserved. "I owe you everything." Victoria's voice firmed, the steel of a woman who'd built an empire beginning to show through the trauma. "Who are you, Marcus Donovan? And why did you save me?" Before Mark could answer, before he could deflect or lie or escape, Detective Morrison pushed through the curtain with a uniformed officer at his back. "Mrs. Hawthorne, I'm Detective James Morrison, Philadelphia PD. I need to take your statement." His gaze shifted to Mark. "And I need Mr. Donovan at the station. Now." "He stays." Victoria's tone brooked no argument despite her weakness. "Whatever you need to ask, he should hear. This man saved my life." Morrison sighed but pulled out his recorder. "Fine, Mrs. Hawthorne, let's start from the beginning. Tell me everything that happened, from Wednesday night forward." For the next hour, Victoria recounted her ordeal in exhaustive detail. Mark listened, his chest tightening with each revelation of Richard's calculated cruelty. The weeks of microdosing poison to build up in her system. The final lethal dose Wednesday night. Dr. Rivers' betrayal. The horror of being conscious in the casket, helpless to stop her own burial. When she finished, Morrison's expression had gone from skeptical to convinced. He turned to Mark. "Your turn. Everything you observed and did." Mark walked through it methodically. The suspicious Mercedes on Wednesday night. The overheard conversation. His recognition of tetrodotoxin poisoning from the symptoms he'd researched. The call to Dr. Chen at Johns Hopkins. The drive to Baltimore Friday for the antidote. Staying at the cemetery all weekend, waiting for the funeral. The decision to intervene at the last possible moment. "Why wait so long?" Morrison asked. "Why not call us Thursday morning?" "Because Victoria Hawthorne wasn't dead yet. You'd have investigated, sure, but how long would that take? Days? A week? By then she'd be in the ground." The death certificate was signed. The burial was scheduled. Richard would have rushed it through. Mark's jaw tightened. "I calculated the risk and decided the only way to save her was to be there ready when it counted most." Morrison studied him for a long beat. "That's either the actions of a very smart man or a very dangerous one. It's the actions of someone who's lost too much to stand by and let evil win." Mark's voice dropped. "I failed to save my daughter. She died because I couldn't push through bureaucracy fast enough, couldn't get experimental equipment approved in time. I've carried that failure for 10 years. I wasn't going to carry another one. The room went quiet. Even Morrison seemed moved by the raw pain in Mark's voice. Victoria broke the silence. Your daughter, how old? 7, Sophie, congenital heart defect. The name still hurt to say aloud. I designed a pediatric cardiac monitor that could have predicted her surgical complications hours in advance. But it wasn't FDA approved yet. They used standard equipment. By the time they detected the problems, it was too late. What happened after? Victoria's question was gentle. My wife blamed me, said if I'd been a better engineer, Sophie would be alive. She left 6 months later. I lost my job when I couldn't focus anymore. Lost my house, lost everything. Mark forced himself to meet her eyes. I spent 2 years on the streets before I got the cemetery job. That apartment and that uniform are all I have left. No. Victoria's voice rang with sudden, fierce certainty. You have more than that. You have integrity, courage, the kind of character that makes someone risk everything for a stranger. She struggled to sit up straighter despite the monitors. When I get out of here, when this is over, you're coming to work for Hawthorne Medical. I can't. Yes, you can. You're a biomedical engineer with FDA experience. You understand toxicology, medical devices, regulatory systems. You're exactly what my company needs. Her expression softened slightly. And you're what I need. Someone I can trust absolutely. Someone who's proven they'll do the right thing when it costs them everything. Grace squeezed her niece's hand. Victoria's right. You saved her life, Marcus. Let her save yours. Before Mark could respond, the curtain flew open again. This time, a man in an expensive suit burst in. David Sterling, Victoria's business partner and one of Hawthorne Medical's major shareholders. His face showed genuine shock and relief as he took in Victoria sitting up, alive, talking. The news said, I saw the videos. I couldn't believe. David's usually smooth composure had cracked entirely. Victoria, thank God. David, Victoria smiled weakly. I'm okay, thanks to Mark here. David turned to Mark, and something complicated crossed his expression. Gratitude mixed with the wariness of someone protective of his business interests. The man who stopped the funeral. I owe you a debt. You don't owe me anything, Mark said again, uncomfortable with the accumulating gratitude. Everyone owes you, David corrected. If Victoria had died, Hawthorne Medical would have collapsed. Richard would have sold it for parts within a year. His businessman's mind was already working through implications. The board needs to know you're alive and recovering. The stock took a hit this afternoon when the news broke. Let them sweat, Victoria said with a flash of her old fire. Tomorrow's soon enough to reassure investors. Tonight, I just want to understand how my husband tried to murder me. Morrison cleared his throat. Speaking of which, we need to discuss next steps. We have Richard and Dr. Rivers in custody. We recovered the syringe Richard tried to use at the cemetery. Preliminary analysis shows concentrated tetrodotoxin, enough to kill within minutes. He looked at Mark. He was planning to make sure you failed. The implication hung in the air. If Mark had been seconds slower, if Richard had reached the casket first, Victoria would be dead. The margin between life and death had been measured in heartbeats. I want to press charges, Victoria said firmly, against both of them. Maximum penalty. Attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud. We're building the case. District attorney's already involved. Morrison closed his notebook. This is going to trial, Mrs. Hawthorne, and it's going to be very public. Good. Steel ran through her voice now. Let everyone see what Richard really is. Let them see what happens when someone tries to destroy me. The detective left with promises to return for follow-up statements. David made some calls to the board and the company's PR team, managing the crisis with smooth efficiency. Grace stepped out to get coffee, leaving Mark alone with Victoria for the first time since the cemetery. Tell me about Sophie. Victoria's request was soft but insistent. Please. I need to understand who saved me. Mark wanted to refuse. The story was his private pain, his secret shame. But something in Victoria's eyes, the understanding of someone who'd faced death and survived, made him speak. She was perfect. His voice came rough. Blue eyes like her mother's. Loved butterflies, drew them constantly. Our whole refrigerator was covered with her art. The memories hurt like knives. The doctors said the heart defect was fixable. Multiple surgeries, but she'd have a full life. He closed his eyes against the flood of remembrance. When she was 5, she needed the big one. Open heart surgery, valve replacement, high risk but necessary. I was working on a new cardiac monitoring system at the time, something that could predict complications before they became critical. I brought it to Children's Hospital, begged them to use it on Sophie. They said it wasn't approved yet, Victoria guessed. The irony being, I worked for the organization that did the approving, but I couldn't fast-track my own device. Conflict of interest. Bitterness leaked into his tone. They used standard equipment. Sophie's surgery went wrong, complications the old monitors missed. By the time they detected it, she was gone. How old? 7, still drawing butterflies, still believing her daddy could fix anything. Mark's hands fisted. I designed machines to save children, and I couldn't save my own. Your wife blamed you. She was right to. If I'd been better, faster, smarter, stop. Victoria's command cut through his spiral. You did everything you could. The system failed. The equipment failed. You didn't. Emma didn't see it that way. She left 6 months later, divorce papers and a note saying she couldn't look at me without seeing Sophie. He forced himself to continue. I fell apart after that. Stopped going to work. Missed deadlines. FDA let me go. Couldn't pay my mortgage. Lost the house. Lost the car. Lost any sense of purpose. The streets. 2 years sleeping rough. Shelters when it got cold. Wanted to die but couldn't work up the courage. Mark looked at her directly. Then last year, Riverside needed someone who understood machinery and systems. Tom Bradley, the maintenance supervisor, took a chance on me, gave me a pool and an apartment. I thought I'd just exist there until I finally had the guts to end it. But you didn't. No, because Wednesday night, I heard Richard and Dr. Rivers planning to murder you. And I realized I had a choice. I could let another person die because of my inaction, or I could use everything I'd learned, every failure, every mistake, every piece of knowledge, to save someone. His voice strengthened. I couldn't save Sophie, but I could save you. And that meant I had to try. Tears ran down Victoria's face now. Sophie would be proud of you. I'm proud of you. I'm nobody. The protest came automatic. You're the man who stood up when everyone else looked away. You're a hero, Marcus Donovan. Victoria reached for his hand, gripped it tight, and I'm going to make sure the whole world knows it. Mark wanted to argue, to deflect, to escape back into the comfortable anonymity of failure and guilt. But the warmth of her hand in his, the absolute certainty in her eyes, made him pause. Maybe, just maybe, he could be someone different than the broken man who had crawled out of the Philadelphia streets. Grace returned with coffee and news that the hospital was swarmed with reporters. Victoria's resurrection had become the lead story on every network. Video of Mark shouting at the funeral, of Victoria sitting up in her casket, of Richard being arrested. All of it was trending worldwide. They want a statement, Grace said. Both of you. Victoria looked at Mark and he saw the question in her eyes. He could still walk away, could refuse the spotlight, retreat into obscurity, let her take the attention alone. But something about the day, about death and life and the narrow margin between them, made him nod. Together, he said, we do it together. 3 hours later, they held a press conference in the hospital's media room. Victoria sat in a wheelchair despite her protests, wearing hospital scrubs and a borrowed cardigan. Mark stood beside her in his wrinkled uniform, beard unkempt, looking every inch the unlikely hero. Grace flanked Victoria's other side, and David stood in the background, managing the logistics. The room was packed with cameras and reporters, the noise level barely controlled chaos. When Victoria raised her hand, silence fell like a curtain. 3 days ago, my husband tried to murder me. Her voice carried clear and strong despite her ordeal. With help from my family doctor, he poisoned me with a paralytic toxin designed to mimic death. I was conscious through it all, heard them discuss my funeral, felt myself placed in that casket. If not for Marcus Donovan, I would be buried alive right now. Cameras flashed, questions erupted, but Victoria spoke over them. Richard Hawthorne didn't just betray me. He betrayed every value Hawthorne Medical stands for. He saw me as a cash prize worth $52 million. A problem to eliminate, not a person to love. She gestured to Mark. This man who had nothing, who'd lost everything, who owed me nothing, risked his job, his safety, his reputation to save someone he'd never met. He's the definition of integrity, of courage, of humanity at its best. Mark stepped forward, uncomfortable but determined. I'm not a hero. I just did what anyone with the knowledge should do when they see evil about to win. A reporter shouted a question. Mr. Donovan, how does it feel to have saved a billionaire's life? It feels like I finally did something right. Mark's voice roughened. I lost my daughter 10 years ago. I couldn't save her, but I could save Victoria Hawthorne, and that means Sophie's death wasn't completely meaningless. The room went quiet at the raw honesty. Victoria reached up and took his hand, squeezing it in front of all the cameras. Richard Sterling faces attempted murder charges, she continued. Dr. Nathan Rivers faces conspiracy charges. Both will go to trial, and I will testify. The world will know what they tried to do. More questions, more chaos, but Victoria was done. Grace wheeled her back toward the elevators while Mark followed, David running interference with the press. Behind them, the story exploded across every platform. The CEO who died and lived, the cemetery worker who became a hero, the husband who revealed himself as a monster. In the quiet of the elevator, Victoria looked up at Mark. You told them about Sophie. She deserved to be remembered. Not just as the daughter I failed, but as the reason I didn't fail this time. Mark met her eyes. Because of her, you're alive. Then I owe her too. Victoria's voice was gentle. When this is over, when the trial ends, I want to honor her. A scholarship, a foundation, something that helps other children with heart defects. Let her name mean hope. Mark couldn't speak past the sudden constriction in his throat. He nodded and Victoria understood. The doors opened on Victoria's private room. Her status and Grace's influence had secured it quickly. The monitors and medical equipment made it feel less like a hotel and more like intensive care. But the view of Philadelphia's skyline through the windows reminded them both of the world still turning outside. Grace helped Victoria into bed while Mark stood awkwardly by the door, unsure whether to stay or go. But Victoria's voice stopped him before he could decide. Don't leave yet, please, just stay for a while. So he stayed, pulled a chair close to the bed while Grace stepped out to make more calls. Victoria's eyes were already growing heavy from exhaustion and the medications keeping her stable. Thank you, she whispered as sleep began to claim her. For Sophie, for me, for being brave when no one else was. Sleep, Mark told her. Tomorrow's soon enough to face what comes next. But as her breathing evened out and the monitors beeped their steady rhythm, Mark knew that tomorrow would bring challenges neither of them had anticipated. Richard would fight the charges. The media would dissect every detail. The trial would be brutal. Yet sitting there in the quiet hospital room, watching over the woman he'd pulled from death's edge, Mark felt something he hadn't experienced in a decade. Purpose. Not redemption. Sophie's death would always haunt him, but the sense that maybe, just maybe, he could still make a difference. He'd saved one life. Perhaps that was enough to justify his own. Outside the window, Philadelphia's lights glittered like promises in the October night. Somewhere in the city, Richard Hawthorne sat in a jail cell, his careful plans destroyed. Somewhere else, Dr. Nathan Rivers was giving his confession, the weight of betrayal crushing him. And in newsrooms and living rooms and social media feeds across the world, people were talking about the impossible resurrection, the unlikely hero in the narrow margin that separated tragedy from triumph. Mark closed his eyes and let himself remember Sophie's face. Not as she'd looked in the hospital, pale and dying, but as she'd been at 5 years old, laughing in their backyard, chasing butterflies with her arms spread wide like wings. I did it, sweetheart, he whispered to memory in empty air. For you, it was always for you. And in the silence that followed, Marcus Donovan, broken engineer, failed father, cemetery worker, an accidental hero, finally allowed himself to believe that maybe the story wasn't over. Maybe there were still butterflies to chase. Maybe, despite everything, there was still light to be found in the darkness. The night stretched on. Victoria slept. Grace returned with coffee and sat vigil with Mark, two souls bound by the day's impossible events. And somewhere between the hospital's fluorescent halls and the star-scattered sky above Philadelphia, justice began its slow, inevitable march toward the courtroom, where truth would be weighed and measured and finally revealed. But that was tomorrow's battle. Tonight, Victoria Hawthorne breathed, and that alone was victory enough. 6 weeks of autumn slipped past like water through cupped hands. Victoria recovered in Grace's townhouse, her strength returning in day by day while lawyers built their case and media outlets dissected every angle of the story that had captivated the nation. The woman buried alive, the hero from nowhere, the husband revealed as a monster. Mark found himself pulled into a different existence entirely. The small cemetery apartment felt like a memory already fading, replaced by a furnished studio Victoria had insisted Hawthorne Medical provide. His worn uniform gave way to professional attire purchased by Grace, who'd taken one look at his threadbare wardrobe and marched him to a tailor. The transformation felt surreal, like wearing someone else's skin, but nothing prepared him for walking through the glass doors of Hawthorne Medical headquarters on a November morning, entering a world he'd abandoned a decade ago. The building rose 30 stories above Philadelphia's business district, all chrome and glass reflecting the gray sky. Inside, the lobby's marble floors stretched beneath modern art installations and a reception desk where 3 people managed the flow of visitors. Mark's reflection in the polished surfaces showed a man he barely recognized, clean-shaven, hair trimmed, wearing a suit that actually fit. Victoria's assistant met him at the elevators, a sharp-eyed woman named Janitor, who'd been briefed to escort him directly to the boardroom. The executive floor hummed with controlled urgency, phones ringing, printers whirring, conversations happening in glass-walled offices where people gestured at monitors and whiteboards. The boardroom itself occupied a corner with panoramic views of the city. 12 directors sat around an oval table, their expressions ranging from curious to skeptical to openly hostile. Victoria presided from the head, looking nothing like the woman who'd gasped for air in a casket 6 weeks ago. Steel had returned to her bearing, though shadows still haunted her eyes when she thought no one was watching. Thompson, the elderly board member who'd blocked Richard at the cemetery, nodded greeting as Mark entered. Sarah Chen, whose sharp business instincts had supported Victoria from the start, offered a slight smile. But Martin Brooks, the CFO, studied Mark with the flat assessment of someone calculating costs and risks. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria's voice cut through the murmured conversations. "This is Marcus Donovan. Many of you know him as the man who saved my life. Today, I'm introducing him as Hawthorne Medical's new special advisor for biomedical innovation." Brooks didn't wait for invitation. "With all respect, Victoria, we're hiring a cemetery worker." The words hung sharp in the air. Mark had expected this, prepared for it, yet still felt the familiar shame creeping up his spine. Victoria's expression could have frozen steel. "We're hiring a former FDA senior biomedical engineer with 15 years developing safety protocols for medical devices. MIT graduate with dual degrees in biomedical engineering and toxicology. Author of 12 peer-reviewed papers on marine toxin applications in pharmaceutical development." She paused, letting the credentials sink in. "Mr. Donovan's resume is more impressive than half this board's." Sarah Chen leaned forward, interest sharpening her features. "Why cemetery work with credentials like that?" The question everyone wanted answered. Mark had rehearsed various responses, different ways to explain the unexplainable. But standing in that room full of people who'd never lost everything, he chose truth. "Personal tragedy broke me." The words came without inflection. Plain statement of fact. "My daughter died from complications I believed I could have prevented. My wife left. I lost my purpose along with my job. The cemetery gave me a reason to exist when I had none." He met Brooks' skeptical gaze directly. "I'm rebuilding. Mrs. Hawthorne is giving me that chance. Rebuilding at our expense." Brooks tapped his pen against the table, sharp little clicks of dismissal. "What exactly will this position cost shareholders?" "Nothing initially. Victoria's tone suggested the conversation was ending, whether Brooks liked it or not. I'm funding Marcus's salary personally for the first year. If the board votes to make the position permanent after reviewing his contributions, corporate budget takes over. If not, I continue funding it privately. Thompson cleared his throat, decades of boardroom experience showing in his diplomatic intervention. What contributions do you envision, Mr. Donovan? Mark pulled a folder from his briefcase, another Grace purchase, and distributed copies around the table. The presentation he'd spent 3 weeks preparing, working late into the nights at his new apartment, drawing on knowledge he'd thought permanently buried. Hawthorne Medical excels at enterprise software, but lacks presence in medical devices. He opened to the first page, technical specifications mixing with market analysis. I propose launching a biomedical division focused on pediatric cardiac monitoring systems, devices that predict complications hours before they become critical. Brooks frowned at the numbers. The medical device market is saturated. Major players dominate every segment. They dominate hospital equipment. Mark moved to the next page, showing market gaps his FDA experience had revealed. No one's effectively targeting remote patient monitoring for underserved populations. Rural areas, low-income families, developing nations with limited hospital infrastructure. The technology exists, the regulatory pathways exist, the market demand exists, but no company has committed to making it affordable and accessible. Sarah Chen studied the projections with growing interest. You're proposing we compete on accessibility rather than premium pricing? I'm proposing we save lives that current business models ignore. Mark's voice steadied as he moved into territory where expertise replaced doubt. My daughter died because experimental equipment wasn't available fast enough. Thousands of children die every year from the same preventable complications. We can change that. The room went quiet. Even Brooks stopped his dismissive pen tapping. Victoria spoke into the silence. This aligns with Hawthorne Medical's core mission. Technology that improves lives, not just quarterly reports. I support moving forward with preliminary development. The trial starts in 3 weeks. Brooks shifted tactics, attacking him from different angle. This scandal has already damaged our reputation. Adding new initiatives now signals instability to investors. The trial proves our integrity. Victoria's eyes glinted with something dangerous. It shows we don't tolerate corruption even from family, and it demonstrates we recognize value regardless of where we find it. Her gaze swept the table. Marcus represents everything Hawthorne Medical claims to value: expertise, ethics, courage. If we don't hire him, we're hypocrites. Thompson nodded slowly. I move we approve the position for 1 year, with quarterly reviews. Sarah Chen seconded immediately. The vote carried 7-5, Brooks and his allies constituting the opposition. Mark had survived his first boardroom battle, though the narrow margin suggested many more fights ahead. After the meeting dispersed, Victoria caught Mark in the hallway. She looked tired despite the polished appearance, and he wondered if nightmares still woke her like they woke him. Dreams of suffocation, of being trapped, of arriving seconds too late. You did well in there. I have you to thank for the opportunity. You have yourself to thank. She touched his arm briefly, the gesture careful. Come to dinner Friday. Grace is cooking. You should meet David properly. He'll be crucial if we actually launch this division. Mark wanted to refuse, wanted to keep professional distance, maintain the boundaries between rescuer and rescued. But something in Victoria's expression, loneliness masquerading as strength, made him accept. The days until the trial passed in a blur of activity. Mark worked from a small office on the executive floor, surrounded by medical journals and FDA regulations he'd once known by heart. The knowledge returned slowly, like muscle memory awakening after long atrophy. He reached out to former colleagues, rebuilding burned bridges with the humility of someone who'd learned the cost of pride. Tom Bradley called one evening, the maintenance supervisor's gravelly voice a reminder of simpler times. Heard you're doing fancy corporate work now. Trying to, anyway. Mark leaned back in his desk chair, watching Philadelphia's lights spread below his window. Feels strange, like playing dress-up. You earned this, Mark. Don't let imposter syndrome tell you different. Tom paused, the sound of clinking glass suggesting beer was involved. Real men don't measure themselves by how many times they fall. They measure themselves by how many times they stand back up and pull others up with them. The words settled into Mark's chest, a warmth he hadn't expected. Thanks, Tom. Just speaking truth. Now get back to saving the world, you stubborn bastard. Friday arrived with gray skies and the promise of winter. Grace's townhouse occupied a quiet street in Rittenhouse Square, 3 stories of brick in history that had sheltered Montgomery women for 4 generations. Inside, warmth and cooking smells created sanctuary against the November chill. David Sterling stood by the fireplace, scotch in hand, projecting the easy confidence of inherited wealth tempered by genuine business acumen. He greeted Mark with a firm handshake and assessing eyes. The hero himself, I've read your preliminary proposal for the biomedical division. David's smile carried approval. Ambitious, possibly brilliant, definitely risky. All innovation carries risk. Spoken like someone who's gambled everything and lost. No judgment in David's tone, just recognition. That's good. People who haven't failed spectacularly tend toward arrogance. They talk business through dinner, Grace's osso buco, which Mark ate mechanically while his mind tracked market projections and regulatory timelines. Victoria watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction, occasionally interjecting insights about company culture and board politics. By dessert, David had committed to introducing Mark to 3 major hospital systems and 2 potential investors. As the evening wound down, Grace pulled Mark aside while Victoria and David debated strategy in the living room. She trusts you completely, you know. Grace's directness had softened slightly with age but remained sharp as ever. Victoria doesn't trust easily. Richard destroyed what little faith she had left in people. I'm just trying to do the job she hired me for. You're doing more than that. You're giving her hope that good people still exist. Grace studied him with grandmotherly concern. But you can't save her from the trial. That's a fight she has to face alone. I'll testify, tell them what I saw. And Richard's lawyer will tear into every vulnerability you have. Your homelessness, your daughter's death. They'll paint you as mentally unstable or opportunistic. Grace's expression hardened. Are you prepared for that? Mark thought about Sophie, about Emma's accusations, about 2 years on Philadelphia streets and the reasons he'd never quite managed to die. I've survived worse. The trial began 3 weeks later in Philadelphia County Courthouse, a gray stone building that had witnessed a century of justice and its failures. Media vans choked the surrounding blocks, satellite dishes sprouting like mushrooms after rain. Inside, the courtroom overflowed with spectators, reporters, and the merely curious who'd lined up before dawn for seats. Judge Margaret Walsh presided, 60 years old with silver hair and a reputation for tolerating neither nonsense nor theatrics. She surveyed her courtroom with the expression of someone who'd seen every trick and believed none of them. Richard sat at the defense table beside Robert Finch, his lawyer, expensive suit, practiced sympathy, eyes calculating every angle. The Richard who'd wept at Victoria's casket had vanished, replaced by someone hollow and mean, Dr. Rivers occupied the adjacent defense table with Margaret Wu, a younger lawyer whose sympathetic demeanor suggested a strategy of victimhood rather than denial. Prosecutor Andrew Callister stood to deliver opening statements, his gray suit and methodical manner projecting competence over flash. This case concerns greed in its purest form. Richard Hawthorne looked at his wife, a woman who gave him everything, and saw only dollar signs. He researched toxins, acquired them illegally, coerced a doctor through threats, planned to bury Victoria Hawthorne alive while she was conscious and aware. The jury, 7 women, 5 men, faces representing Philadelphia's diversity, listened with varying degrees of horror and skepticism. Callister walked them through the evidence methodically, building his case like constructing a building, each fact a brick mortared to the next. Finch's opening relied on different strategy. The prosecution asked you to believe a fantastical story. A cemetery worker, homeless for years, unemployed, struggling with mental health, suddenly becomes a hero. But consider this, what if Marcus Donovan saw an opportunity? A wealthy woman dies. Her husband is devastated. And this man inserts himself into their tragedy with wild claims and dramatic interventions. The implication hung poisonous in the air. Mark felt eyes turning toward him, speculation replacing certainty. Victoria testified second day, taking the stand in a charcoal suit that projected power despite the ordeal she was reliving. Callister led her through the events with clinical precision, letting the facts speak. Wednesday, October 4th. Richard brought dinner to my study around 8 p.m. Her voice held steady, CEO addressing a hostile board. Seafood pasta from Giovanni's, a restaurant we'd frequented throughout our marriage. We ate together. He was attentive in ways he hadn't been for months. Asked about my day, complimented my work on the Novatech merger. When did you first feel symptoms? Within the hour, tingling in my lips and fingertips. I mentioned it to Richard, said I thought stress was catching up with me. Victoria's hands remained folded on the witness stand, the only sign of tension, a whiteness around her knuckles. He suggested I rest, said he'd call Dr. Rivers. Describe what happened next. The numbness spread rapidly. Within 20 minutes, I couldn't move, couldn't speak. But I remained completely conscious. The courtroom leaned forward collectively. I heard Richard on the phone with Dr. Rivers, heard him say I'd collapsed, heard Rivers arrive and examine me cursorily. Callister approached with a transcript. Did you hear them discuss your condition? I heard Richard ask how long and until it was certain. Dr. Rivers said 12 to 16 hours, then he'd certify cardiac arrest as cause of death. Victoria's voice dropped but never wavered. Richard asked if I might wake. Rivers said not with that dose. Several jurors reacted visibly. Richard's face remained impassive, but his lawyer scribbled notes frantically. What else do you remember? Everything. The word fell like a stone. Being placed in the casket, the viewing where Richard played the devastated husband, the drive to the cemetery, the funeral service, hearing them prepare to lower me into the ground. Her eyes found Mark in the gallery, then a voice shouting to stop, Marcus Donovan's voice. You were conscious when he administered the antidote? I felt the drops, tasted bitterness, then warmth spreading through my veins like fire. Victoria's composure cracked slightly, tears threatening. My fingers started moving. Light flooded back, and I could breathe again. Finch's cross-examination came gentle at first, respectfully probing. Mrs. Hawthorne, you've been under tremendous stress, running a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Your health had been declining for weeks before this incident. I wasn't ill. I was being poisoned. You've made that claim, yes, but isn't it possible you experienced a genuine medical emergency, and in the confusion of recovery, your mind constructed a narrative to explain the trauma? Victoria's eyes went cold. Are you suggesting I imagined my husband's satisfaction when I collapsed? Imagined a Rivers timeline for my death? Imagined Richard pulling a syringe full of poison at my graveside? I'm suggesting human memory is fallible, particularly under extreme duress. My memory is perfect, and it will convict your client. Mark took the stand on day 3, acutely aware of the scrutiny from jury, media, and spectators who'd reduced his life to entertainment. Callister established his credentials efficiently: MIT degrees, FDA career, published research on marine toxins. How did you identify tetrodotoxin poisoning? 7 years of specialized research. I knew the compound's effects intimately, how it blocks sodium channels, mimics death, requires specific antidotes. Mark kept his voice level, professional. When I saw Mrs. Hawthorne in the casket, several indicators were wrong for natural death. No livor mortis, skin too uniformly pale, body temperature too low. Most telling, no rigor mortis in extremities. You observed these signs despite the viewing having concluded? I managed cemetery operations. I was checking the site preparation when I overheard a conversation 3 nights before the funeral. Mark recounted the Mercedes by the maintenance gate, the voices discussing successful poisoning and rushed burial. The jury listened intently, several taking notes. Callister introduced phone records showing Mark's call to Dr. Robert Chen at Johns Hopkins, prescription documentation for the antidote, security footage of Mark staying at the cemetery all weekend. Each piece of evidence supported his testimony, building toward a picture of methodical intervention rather than opportunistic fraud. Then Finch rose for cross-examination, and the attack Mark had prepared for began. Mr. Donovan, you lost your job at the FDA. Why? I couldn't function after my daughter's death. Missed deadlines, poor performance reviews. They let me go. You were homeless for approximately 2 years? Yes. Living in shelters? Begging for food? Finch's tone dripped false sympathy. That must have been incredibly difficult. It was survival. And during this time, you sought psychiatric treatment? Mark's jaw tightened. The records were sealed, but lawyers had ways. I spoke with counselors at shelters, part of accessing services. These counselors documented severe depression, suicidal ideation, grief-induced psychosis in the months after your wife left. Finch produced documents, waving them at the jury. Yet we're expected to believe that 3 years later, you're stable enough to identify rare poisons and execute daring rescues. I was grieving, not insane, and my daughter's death gave me expertise I used to save Victoria Hawthorne, or gave you delusions that made you see conspiracies where none existed. Finch paced, performing for the jury now. Isn't it true you blame yourself for Sophie's death? The name landed like a fist. Mark forced himself to breathe through the spike of pain. I carry responsibility, yes. You believe if you'd been a better engineer, faster, smarter, she'd be alive? Objection. Callister was on his feet. Relevance? Goes to the witness's state of mind and credibility. Judge Walsh considered. I'll allow it. Proceed carefully, Mr. Finch. The lawyer turned back to Mark, scenting weakness. You see saving Victoria Hawthorne as redemption for failing your daughter. Isn't that what this is really about? Mark's hands gripped the witness stand edge. Truth or deflection, self-protection or honesty. He chose the path that had brought him this far. Every day I wake knowing I couldn't save Sophie. Maybe I did see Victoria as a chance to make up for that failure. His voice strengthened, certainty replacing doubt. But that doesn't make Richard innocent, doesn't make me a liar. I saved a woman's life. Whatever my motivations, that's truth. The courtroom went still. Even Finch seemed momentarily off balance, his script disrupted by raw honesty instead of defensive denials. No further questions. Finch sat down, his expression suggesting the exchange hadn't gone quite as planned. Day 5 brought Richard to the stand, and the courtroom packed beyond capacity with those hungry to hear the accused speak. He wore expensive tailoring and projected wounded dignity, the performance polished by weeks of lawyer coaching. Under Finch's gentle questioning, Richard painted himself as devoted husband, supportive partner, man destroyed by false accusations. I loved Victoria. I would never harm her. That night she felt ill. I immediately called for medical help. I did everything a husband should do. But Callister dismantled the narrative piece by methodical piece. Shipping records for tetrodotoxin from a Miami black market supplier. Casino debt totaling $8.3 million. Life insurance policies worth $50 million. Email chains discussing company control and asset liquidation. You needed Mrs. Hawthorne dead by October 15th to satisfy gambling debts. Not a question, a statement backed by documentation spread across screens for jury viewing. I had financial difficulties. That doesn't make me a murderer. Then explain the syringe recovered at the cemetery. Callister held up the evidence bag, liquid still visible inside. Forensic analysis confirms concentrated tetrodotoxin. Lethal dose. You pulled this out when Marcus Donovan administered the antidote. Richard's composure began cracking at the edges. I was confused, in shock. I don't remember. You screamed that she was supposed to stay dead. Callister played the video, phones capturing Richard's breakdown at the graveside, his mask shattering in real time. The jury watched in silence as Richard's own words condemned him. But the real destruction came from evidence none of them expected. Callister produced recordings, phone calls from county jail, legally obtained through proper channels. The prosecutor played them for the hushed courtroom. Richard's voice hard and calculating. Listen carefully. The board is already nervous about Victoria. When I'm acquitted, we execute phase 2. Contact Thompson and Brooks. Offer them each $5 million. Vote her out. Install me as CEO. The trial will damage her reputation enough. We just need to push harder. The courtroom erupted. Judge Walsh hammered her gavel repeatedly, barely restoring order. Richard's face had gone white, then purple with rage. That's out of context. They trapped me. But Callister wasn't finished. More recordings played. Richard discussing asset liquidation, offshore accounts, plans to sell Hawthorne Medical piece by piece once he controlled it. Each revelation stripped away another layer of the grieving husband mask until only naked greed remained. She had everything. Richard's shout cut through the noise, unfiltered and desperate. I worked for her company 5 years like a servant. While she made billions, I got a salary. I'm her husband. I deserved half. Finch grabbed his arm, trying to shut him down, but Richard shook him off with manic strength. I would have been a better CEO, but she treated me like decoration. The words poured out in a torrent of long-suppressed resentment. Yes, I poisoned her. Yes, I planned it. And if that cemetery rat hadn't interfered, I'd be running my company right now. The confession hung in the air like gunsmoke. Cameras captured everything. Richard seemed to realize too late what he'd done, his face collapsing into something between rage and horror. Judge Walsh ordered recess, but the damage was complete. Richard had confessed in open court, on video, with hundreds of witnesses. His lawyer's objections and motions meant nothing against the reality of those recorded words. During the break, de Rivers was called for clarification on his own charges. The older man took the stand looking decades beyond his 52 years, shoulders bowed under guilt's weight. Margaret Wu led him through testimony designed to paint him as Richard's victim rather than accomplice. But when Callister cross-examined, asking about specific threats Richard had made, Rivers broke entirely. He showed me photographs of my daughter Melissa at MIT, said he had connections to drug dealers who'd plant heroin in her dorm. Tears streamed down Rivers' face unchecked. One call, and my daughter would be arrested, expelled, her future destroyed. She's all I have. The jury watched with a mixture of sympathy and disgust as the doctor continued. I chose Melissa over my oath, over Victoria, who trusted me, funded my hospital wing, given me everything. I'm a coward, and I deserve whatever punishment comes. When Victoria was recalled to respond, she stood before Rivers with an expression that mixed fury and something resembling pity. You let them put me in a casket, knowing I was alive, knowing I could hear, could feel, could experience every moment of my own burial. I'm so sorry. Rivers couldn't meet her eyes. I was weak. I was terrified. You were human. The words stopped him cold, and Richard exploited that humanity to turn you into an accessory to murder. Victoria's voice dropped to something hard and final. I don't forgive you, but I understand how he broke you, because he almost broke me too. Closing arguments came on day 7, both sides knowing the outcome but required to perform their roles. Callister summarized the mountain of evidence, shipping records, financial documents, recorded confessions, expert testimony. He painted Richard as calculating predator and Dr. Rivers as coerced accomplice. Finch tried damage control, arguing temporary insanity, extreme duress, reasonable doubt about premeditation. But Richard's courtroom confession had demolished any hope of acquittal. The best Finch could do was plead for leniency, and even that felt performative. The jury deliberated 3 hours, remarkably quick for a case this complex, suggesting how thoroughly Richard had condemned himself. When they returned, the foreman read the verdicts with appropriate gravity. Richard Hawthorne, guilty on all counts, attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, extortion. Nathan Rivers, guilty of conspiracy, medical malpractice, falsifying death certificates. But the jury recommended mercy given the coercion evidence. Judge Walsh scheduled sentencing for the following week, allowing victim impact statements and pre-sentencing reports. As deputies led Richard away in handcuffs, he twisted back toward Victoria one final time. You destroyed my life. Her response came cold and clear. No, Richard, you destroyed your own life the moment you chose greed over love. I'm just making sure everyone knows it. Sentencing day brought finality. Judge Walsh addressed Richard first, her tone carrying the weight of decades enforcing consequences. Richard Hawthorne, you are a disgrace to your marriage vows, to basic human decency, to every standard by which civilized people live. You nearly committed the perfect murder. Only chance and one man's conscience stopped you. She paused, letting the words sink in. I sentence you to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. May you spend every day of that sentence contemplating the woman you tried to bury and the life you threw away. Richard's screams echoed through the courtroom as deputies dragged him toward the door. This isn't over. I'll appeal. The door closed, cutting off his rage. Dr. Rivers received 15 years with parole eligibility after 10, Judge Walsh acknowledging the coercion while refusing to excuse the betrayal. You broke your oath and permanently surrendered your medical license. Use your prison time to reflect on the man you became and the man you might have been. Outside the courthouse, Victoria made a brief statement to the assembled media. Justice has been served. Richard Hawthorne will spend his life in prison where he belongs. And Hawthorne Medical will move forward, stronger and more committed to ethical innovation. Mark stood beside her, uncomfortable with the cameras but present because she'd asked. A reporter shouted a question about his role in the trial. I testified truthfully about what I observed. That's all. You're a hero, Mr. Donovan. How does it feel? It feels like the beginning of something new. For both of us. The car ride back to corporate headquarters passed in companionable silence. Grace and David, having peeled off to handle other business. Victoria stared out the window at Philadelphia passing by. The city where she'd almost been buried now spread before her like a promise renewed. Thank you, her voice came quiet, for testifying, for standing there while they attacked your mental health, your daughter's memory, everything that makes you vulnerable. I told the truth. That's all anyone can do. Most people don't, though. Not when it costs them. Victoria turned to look at him directly. You kept your word even when it hurt. That matters more than you know. The company had arranged a small celebration, modest by corporate standards but meaningful nonetheless. The executive floor gathered in the main conference room, champagne flowing despite the afternoon hour. Board members who'd voted against Mark's hiring now approached with congratulations, their opposition tempered by the trial's outcome, validating Victoria's judgment. Sarah Chen cornered Mark by the windows. The biomedical division proposal. I've been reviewing the numbers. They're solid, but they rely on FDA relationships you claim to still have. I've been rebuilding those connections. Former colleagues who remember my work. Can you get us expedited review? I can get us fair review. Expedited depends on the quality of our submissions. Mark met her skepticism with hard-won experience. Good science moves faster than mediocre science, regardless of connections. Then let's make sure our science is exceptional. Sarah's smile suggested she was warming to the idea. I'm moving my vote from neutral to supportive. Don't make me regret it. Brooks remained distant, his opposition more entrenched now than before the trial. But with Thompson and Sarah both firmly supportive, Mark's position had stabilized. The real work was just beginning, transforming proposals into prototypes, prototypes into products, products into lives saved. Elena appeared near sunset, surprising Mark at his desk where he'd retreated from the party. She wore jeans and a community center t-shirt, her social worker practicality, a stark contrast to corporate polish surrounding them. Thought you might need rescuing from your own celebration. Her smile carried understanding earned through 2 years of patient friendship. Want to get real food instead of catered shrimp? They ended up at a diner in South Philadelphia, the kind of place that served breakfast all day and didn't care about dress codes. Elena ordered coffee and pie while Mark worked through a burger, both of them grateful for normalcy after weeks of courtroom intensity. You did it, Elena's voice held quiet pride. Saved her life, testified, survived having lawyers dissect your worst moments. Just did what needed doing. That's what makes you remarkable. You never see it. She reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. You're allowed to feel good about this, Mark. You're allowed to believe you're a good man. He wanted to deflect, to minimize, to retreat into familiar self-doubt, but Elena's steady gaze wouldn't permit the escape. She'd been there through the worst months after his cemetery hiring, listening to stories about Sophie, about Emma's departure, about the years when dying seemed easier than living. She'd never judged, never pushed, never demanded more than he could give. I keep waiting for it to feel real. The confession slipped out unbidden. Like I'll wake up in the cemetery apartment and realize it was all a dream. It's real. You're really here, really rebuilding, really making a difference. Elena squeezed his hand. And I'm really proud of you. Something shifted in Mark's chest, a warmth he'd thought permanently frozen. Maybe, just maybe, he could allow himself this, could accept that despite every failure, every loss, every night sleeping rough on Philadelphia streets, he'd somehow found his way back to purpose. They talked until the diner's late shift arrived, conversation meandering through safe topics and careful explorations of what might be building between them. No pressure, no demands, just the slow recognition of two people who both survived their own kinds of darkness. When Mark finally returned to his apartment, exhaustion and relief hit simultaneously. The trial was over. Richard would spend his life in prison. Dr. Rivers would serve his time and emerge broken but free. And Victoria Hawthorne was alive, powerful, and planning to transform Hawthorne Medical into something unprecedented. His phone buzzed with a text from Tom Bradley. Saw you on the news, fancy suit and all. Still remember us little people when you're saving the world? Mark smiled and typed back. Come to the city Friday, drinks on me. Need someone to keep me grounded. Deal. Proud of you, brother. The word brother settled into Mark's chest like an anchor. He'd spent years believing he had nothing left. No connections worth maintaining. No relationships that could survive his failures. But Tom had been there when Mark was nobody. Elena had stayed when he'd given her every reason to leave. Victoria had trusted him when trusting anyone seemed impossible. Grace had seen past the worn uniform to the man underneath. Perhaps strength wasn't about never falling. Perhaps it was about the people who helped you stand back up and the courage to let them. Saturday morning brought rain and the beginning of normal life after extraordinary events. Mark worked at his desk, drafting equipment specifications and regulatory submissions, the technical language flowing easier with each hour. This was the work he trained for, the purpose Sophie's death had pointed him toward even if he couldn't see it through years of grief. Victoria called around noon, her tone carrying excitement rather than the exhaustion that had marked her voice since the poisoning. I've been thinking about what you said, about Sophie, about honoring her memory. You don't have to. I want to. We're establishing the Sophie Donovan Memorial Fund for Pediatric Cardiac Research. $5 million initial endowment, scholarships for medical students, grants for innovative equipment development, support for families facing the same battles you fought. Victoria paused, letting the words sink in. If we're going to build this biomedical division, it should carry her name. Sophie Donovan would have been 17 now. Let's make sure other 17-year-olds get the chances she didn't. Mark couldn't speak past the sudden constriction in his throat. Sophie's name, spoken not with pity or condolence, but with purpose and promise. His daughter becoming legacy instead of just loss. Thank you. The words were wholly inadequate, but all he could manage. Thank you for giving me the chance to do something meaningful with my second chance at life. Victoria's voice softened. We're both starting over, Marcus. Let's make it count. The weeks after the trial blurred into months of intense work. The biomedical division took shape slowly, hiring engineers and researchers, establishing partnerships with hospitals, navigating FDA requirements Mark knew intimately from his former career. The Sophie Donovan Memorial Fund drew attention from medical journals and philanthropic organizations, Victoria's endorsement lending credibility to the cause. Elena stayed constant throughout, her patience never wavering as Mark learned to balance professional resurrection with personal healing. They took walks along the Schuylkill River, attended concerts neither particularly enjoyed, built something neither was quite ready to name, but both recognized as important. Tom visited monthly, their friendship deepening beyond cemetery camaraderie into something resembling brotherhood. The older man's grounded wisdom provided counterweight to corporate pressures, reminding Mark that worth wasn't measured in quarterly reports or board approval ratings. Victoria and David's friendship evolved into partnership, into something more, though both moved with the caution of people who'd learned trust cost. Grace watched them navigate their careful courtship with grandmother's satisfaction, occasionally engineering dinners where Mark and Elena would join them, 4 people learning to build lives from disaster's rubble. The Sophie Donovan prototype cardiac monitor passed its first clinical trial 6 months after the trial ended. The device predicted complications with 93% accuracy, giving doctors crucial hours to intervene before crisis points. Hospitals in Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Boston requested pilot programs. The FDA fast-tracked review based on early data and Mark's reputation. Standing in the lab watching the monitor's display track a young patient's vitals, Mark felt Sophie's presence like sunlight through clouds. Not the crushing grief that had defined the decades since her death, but something gentler. Acceptance mixed with purpose. Love transformed from wound into fuel. She'd be proud of you. Victoria stood beside him, both of them watching the screen. I never met her, but I know that truth. I failed her once. At least now I'm trying to make that failure mean something. You didn't fail her, Marcus. The system failed you both, but you're fixing the system now. Victoria's reflection in the monitor glass showed determination mixed with her own hard-won peace. That's what survivors do. We take our scars and turn them into armor for others. The words hung in the air like a promise, not that pain would disappear or trauma would fade, but that both could be transmuted into something beyond themselves. From ashes to dawn, from death to life, from failure to purpose. Outside the hospital, Philadelphia stretched into evening, millions of lives unfolding in their own patterns of loss and recovery, despair and hope. Somewhere in that vast city, children were being born with heart defects. Somewhere parents were making desperate bargains with doctors and gods. Somewhere the next Sophie was fighting for breath. But now, because one man had stood up at a cemetery and refused to let evil win, because one woman had survived her own burial and chosen to fight rather than hide, because both had found the courage to trust despite every reason not to, now those children had better chances. Mark's phone buzzed with a message from Elena. Dinner tonight? I'm cooking. He smiled and typed acceptance, then turned back to the monitor's steady rhythm. The heartbeat displayed there belonged to a 7-year-old girl recovering from surgery, the same age Sophie had been when she died. The same defect corrected because technology had finally caught up to need. The monitor beeped its reassuring pattern, each pulse a tiny victory. Not redemption. Mark had learned that redemption wasn't something you earned, only something you accepted. But purpose, definitely. Meaning, absolutely. The sense that maybe, despite everything, the story wasn't over, but just beginning. He thought about Tom's words from months ago. Real men don't measure themselves by how many times they fall. They measure themselves by how many times they stand back up and pull others up with them. Mark had fallen further than most, but he'd stood back up. And now, with Victoria's trust, in Elena's patience, in Tom's friendship anchoring him, with Sophie's memory driving him forward instead of pulling him down, he was finally pulling others up too. That, more than any courtroom victory or corporate position or media praise, was what mattered. The monitor continued its steady rhythm. The girl's parents sat beside her bed, exhausted but hopeful. The Sophie Donovan device gave them information that meant the difference between life and death, intervention and crisis, future and tragedy. Victoria touched Mark's shoulder briefly before leaving, a gesture of respect between equals rather than gratitude between rescued and rescuer. Board meeting Tuesday. They want to see the full expansion proposal. It'll be ready. I know it will. You always deliver. After she left, Mark stayed a while longer, watching the monitor do its quiet work. Saving lives one heartbeat at a time. Making Sophie's death mean something beyond just loss. Transforming his own failures into foundations for others' survival. Outside, rain had started again, washing Philadelphia streets clean. Inside, technology and human will combined to push back against death's inevitability. The struggle was eternal, the victories always temporary, but the fight itself gave meaning to everything that had come before. Mark pulled out his phone and looked at the photo he'd carried through every dark day since her death. Sophie at 5, arms spread wide, chasing butterflies in their backyard. Her smile caught mid-laugh, pure joy frozen in pixels. We did it, sweetheart, he whispered to the image. We're making it count. And somewhere in the space between memory and hope, between past tragedy and future possibility, Marcus Donovan felt his daughter's approval like grace descending. Not absolution for failing her, that wound would never fully heal, but recognition that he'd finally found a way to honor her life by protecting others. The monitor beeped its steady pattern. The girl slept peacefully. Her parents dozed in uncomfortable chairs. And Mark walked out into the Philadelphia rain, ready to face whatever battles came next, knowing that this time, finally, impossibly, gratefully, he wasn't fighting alone. 8 months after the trial, winter gave way to spring, and Hawthorne Medical faced a different kind of crisis. The boardroom that had cautiously welcomed Mark now bristled with tension as quarterly reports painted an uncomfortable picture. Stock prices had recovered from the scandal's initial shock, but plateaued below expectations. 3 major clients had defected to competitors. The biomedical division consumed resources without yet producing revenue. Brooks led the charge with spreadsheets and projections that made failure look inevitable. We're hemorrhaging cash on experimental technology while proven business lines stagnate. The board has a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, not sentimental initiatives. Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his chair, age and politics wearing on loyalties that had seemed solid months ago. Sarah Chen held firm, but her isolation was visible. The mathematics of board votes had shifted against Victoria in ways that quarterly earnings couldn't justify alone. Mark watched the maneuvering with growing unease. Something beyond legitimate business concerns was driving the opposition. Brooks' attacks carried a precision that suggested coordination, a strategy developed in conversations Mark wasn't privy to. Victoria maintained control through sheer force of will, but exhaustion showed in the tightness around her eyes. She'd survived attempted murder only to face death by 1,000 corporate cuts. After the meeting adjourned, she stood at the windows overlooking Philadelphia, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. He's still winning. The words came flat, drained of fight. Richard's in prison, but his plan is working anyway. Destroy my reputation, undermine the board's confidence, force me out. Mark approached carefully. Brooks is coordinating something. The opposition is too organized to be organic. I know, but I can't prove it, and I'm too tired to fight shadows. She turned to face him, and for the first time since the cemetery, Mark saw defeat in her expression. Maybe they're right. Maybe I should step aside, let someone else lead. You don't believe that. I don't know what I believe anymore. Victoria's voice cracked slightly. I built this company from nothing. Gave it everything. And now they're taking it away piece by piece, and I'm supposed to just accept it as good business. The vulnerability in her admission struck Mark like a blow. Victoria Hawthorne, who'd survived paralysis and burial, was breaking under institutional pressure. The realization catalyzed something in him, a recognition that survival meant more than just breathing, that resurrection demanded constant refusal to stay buried. Then we fight harder. His tone carried certainty he'd learned from falling and standing repeatedly. You didn't pull yourself out of that casket to let boardroom politics bury you again. Over the next 72 hours, Mark barely slept. He pulled every connection from his FDA years, called in favors from former colleagues, traced financial patterns through public filings and corporate databases. The answer emerged slowly, buried in documents most people wouldn't think to connect. Brooks had been negotiating with the Novatech for months, not just discussing the acquisition offer that had been publicly acknowledged, but structuring a consulting deal worth $15 million personally if the sale went through. The CFO stood to profit enormously from Victoria's removal and the company's dissolution. More damning, phone records showed regular contact between Brooks and Richard's attorney, continuing even after the conviction. The conspiracy Richard had orchestrated from jail hadn't ended with his sentencing. It had simply found new instruments. Mark presented the evidence to Victoria in her office on a Friday evening, spreadsheets and phone logs spread across her desk like evidence at trial. She studied them with the methodical focus of someone who'd learned to trust nothing at face value. This is enough to destroy him, but not enough to satisfy the shareholders worried about quarterly performance. Mark laid out his other folder, the one that had consumed his nights for weeks. We need to show them the future, not just expose the past. The shareholder meeting convened 2 weeks later in a hotel ballroom that felt more like a trial than a business gathering. 500 investors filled the seats, their collective worth measured in billions, their patience measured in quarters. Media packed the rear section, cameras trained on the stage where Brooks sat with Thompson and three other board members representing the opposition. Victoria entered with Mark and Sarah Chen flanking her, David Sterling providing quiet support from the front row beside Grace. The room's energy shifted as she took the podium, part sympathy for the woman who'd survived attempted murder, part calculation about whether that survival meant anything for their portfolios. Brooks opened with practiced corporate sympathy that barely masked the knife underneath. We're grateful Victoria survived her ordeal, but leadership requires more than survival. It requires results. And our results have been disappointing. He clicked through slides showing declining metrics and ballooning costs. I propose we accept Novatech's acquisition offer, $3.2 billion. Clean exit, shareholder value preserved. Applause rippled through certain sections. The investors who'd bought high and wanted to cut losses, the opportunists who saw quick profit over long-term value. Victoria stood, and the room quieted to hear what the woman pulled from a grave would say in defense of her empire. But instead of speaking, she gestured to Mark. Before we discuss sale terms, hear from Marcus Donovan. The man who saved my life has also been saving this company's future. Mark approached the podium with the controlled nerves of someone who'd testified in criminal court and survived. This audience was different, harder in some ways, more mercenary, caring nothing for justice but everything for return on investment. Martin Brooks wants you to believe Hawthorne Medical is failing. He's right about one thing: we're transforming, and transformation is expensive. Mark activated his presentation, and the screen filled with data Brooks hadn't shown. But he's lying about the outcome. The accusation landed hard. Brooks started to interrupt, but Sarah Chen cut him off with a motion to let Mark continue. The biomedical division has secured contracts with 17 hospital systems, pre-orders totaling $120 million. FDA fast-track approval for our pediatric cardiac monitoring system, with full certification expected within 60 days. Mark's voice strengthened as he moved into territory where expertise replaced doubt. Mr. Brooks presented this as reckless spending. I'm presenting it as strategic investment that will triple our company valuation within 3 years. He clicked to the next slide, the Sophie Donovan device in clinical trials, saving the life of a 9-year-old boy whose complications the monitor had predicted 6 hours before crisis. The image was more powerful than any spreadsheet, life and death rendered visible. This technology exists because Victoria Hawthorne refused to let her near-death experience make her cautious. She chose audacity over safety, innovation over maintenance. Mark paused, letting the words resonate. Brooks wants you to sell the company for $3 billion today. I'm projecting a $6 billion valuation by 2028, based on conservative market penetration estimates in a $450 billion global medical device industry. The skepticism in the room shifted slightly, still present, but now calculating rather than dismissive. But there's something else you should know about Martin Brooks's recommendation. Mark displayed the evidence he'd compiled, the Novatech consulting agreement, the contact with Richard's attorney, the timeline showing coordination between imprisoned felon and sitting CFO. He stands to personally profit $15 million from this sale. He's been working with Richard Hawthorne's legal team to destabilize board confidence and force a sale that benefits him. Not you. The room erupted. Brooks was on his feet, face flushed with fury. That's slander. I'll sue. You'll do nothing except resign. Sarah Chen's voice cut through the noise like a blade. I've verified everything Marcus presented. You violated fiduciary duty, engaged in conflicts of interest, and conspired with a convicted felon. Security is waiting to escort you from the building. Thompson sat frozen, his earlier opposition now looking like complicity or foolishness. The other board members who'd sided with Brooks were frantically distancing themselves, realizing too late they'd been used. Victoria returned to the podium as Brooks was let out, still shouting threats that meant nothing against documented proof. She waited for silence with the patience of someone who'd learned that justice moves at its own pace. I nearly died in October. My husband tried to bury me alive for money, and in the months since, I've learned that surviving isn't the same as living. Her voice carried across the ballroom with the authority of someone who'd earned every word through ordeal. Martin Brooks wanted me to play it safe, to sell out rather than build something meaningful. But I didn't claw my way out of a grave to run from challenges. She gestured to Mark. This man risked everything to save my life when he had no reason to care whether I lived or died. He's given us a roadmap to transform Hawthorne Medical from a good company into a great one. The only question is whether you have the courage to follow it. The vote came swiftly once Brooks's corruption was exposed. 68% supported Victoria's continued leadership in the biomedical division expansion. The coup attempt had failed, undermined by the same man whose intervention at a cemetery had started everything. Afterward, in the quiet of Victoria's office, she pulled Mark into a brief embrace that surprised them both. You saved my life twice now. Just returning the favor, you gave me reasons to keep living when I'd run out of my own. We saved each other then. She released him, composure returning, but something warmer underneath. The board wants you as permanent VP of Innovation, full executive position, stock options, the works. Mark thought about the cemetery apartment that had been his whole world a year ago, about the decades spent in grief paralysis, about Sophie, whose death had seemed like pure loss until it became the knowledge that saved Victoria, which became the purpose that pulled him back from his own kind of grave. I accept. On one condition, the division officially carries Sophie's name, the Sophie Donovan Biomedical Division. Done. Victoria smiled, genuine warmth breaking through executive polish. She'd be proud of you, Marcus. I hope so. I'm finally starting to believe I didn't waste the years she should have had. 6 months later, the FDA approved the cardiac monitoring system for national distribution. The device bore Sophie's name on a small plaque, Sophie Donovan Memorial Monitor, and shipped to hospitals across 43 states. Each installation came with documentation explaining the 7-year-old girl whose death had driven her father to develop technology that would save thousands of others. Mark stood in Johns Hopkins Pediatric Cardiac Unit watching nurses train on the equipment and felt the weight of a decade's grief transform into something bearable. Not forgiven, he'd never forgive himself for failing Sophie, but transmuted, like coal compressed into something harder and clearer. Elena found him there, having driven up from Philadelphia after her shift at the community center. She'd been patient through his resurrection, never demanding more than he could give, never pulling away when nightmares made him wake screaming. 2 years of careful friendship had evolved into something neither had fully named, but both recognized as essential. You did it. Her voice held quiet pride mixed with affection. Sophie's name is going to save children she never met. It doesn't bring her back. No, but it means her life mattered beyond just the years she had. Elena took his hand, the gesture comfortable now after months of small intimacies, building towards something larger. And it means you've finally forgiven yourself for being human. I'm not sure forgiveness is possible, but I'm learning to carry it differently. That's all any of us can do, carry our losses until they become lighter. She leaned against him, offering support that asked nothing in return. I'm proud of you, Marcus, not just for saving Victoria or building this division, for choosing to keep living when dying would have been easier. The words settled into his chest like grace, like the absolution he'd never quite believed he deserved. Mark pulled Elena closer, grateful beyond expression for her patience, her presence, her refusal to let him disappear into the guilt's comfortable darkness. Come with me to dinner tonight. Victoria and David are celebrating their engagement. Grace is cooking. Elena smiled. Family dinner then. The family we chose instead of the one we were born into. The phrase resonated, found family, forged through crisis and choice rather than blood. Mark had lost his biological family to death and divorce, but he'd built something new from the rubble. Tom's grounded wisdom, Elena's steadfast patience, Victoria's fierce loyalty, Grace's matriarchal protection, David's partnership, even Sarah Chen's sharp-minded support. Perhaps that was what resurrection really meant. Not erasing what had been lost, but building something new from the fragments that remained. Evening brought them to Grace's townhouse, where Victoria and David announced their engagement with understated joy that spoke to how much both had learned about what mattered. David had proposed at Riverside Memorial Gardens, the cemetery where Mark had stopped Victoria's funeral. the place where both their transformations had begun. We figured if that's where we started, it should be where we committed to continuing. David's arms circled Victoria's waist with protective affection that never crossed into possession. Plus, it felt right to honor the place where the impossible happened. Grace toasted them with champagne, her eyes bright with tears she'd never admit were falling. To second chances and the courage to take them. The words became a refrain as dinner progressed, each person adding their own variation. Tom, who'd driven up from the cemetery for the occasion, raised his glass with characteristic directness. To falling down and getting back up, and to pulling others up with you when you stand. Mark felt the phrase settle into his bones, the same words Tom had offered months ago, now proven true through action and outcome. He'd fallen as far as anyone could fall without dying. But he'd stood back up, and in standing, he had pulled Victoria from her grave, metaphorical and literal both. A year later, 2 weddings happened within months of each other. Mark and Elena married in October at a small chapel, Tom serving as best man, Sophie's memory honored through readings about butterflies and love that transcends loss. Victoria and David followed in December, a larger affair that mixed Philadelphia society with the found family that had formed through crisis. The double ceremonies felt less like separate events than chapters in a shared story, people who'd been broken, learning to build something whole from the pieces that remained. Time moved forward the way it always does, indifferent to human drama but shaped by human choice. The Sophie Donovan Biomedical Division grew into Hawthorne Medical's most profitable segment, saving over 10,000 lives in its first 3 years. Mark's innovations won industry recognition, though he deflected praise toward the teams that made his visions real. Elena and Mark welcomed a son they named Daniel, and the first time Mark held his baby, he felt Sophie's absence as keenly as ever. But mixed with that grief came gratitude that he'd survived long enough to experience fatherhood again, to have another chance at the role where he'd failed so catastrophically before. Victoria and David welcomed a daughter they named Sophie Grace, honoring both the child who died and the woman who'd helped Victoria survive. The gesture moved Mark beyond words, his daughter's name becoming legacy rather than just loss, other children carrying forward the memory of the girl he'd loved and failed. 2 years after the weddings, on a warm Sunday afternoon, both families gathered in Victoria's garden. Daniel, now 2, chased Sophie Grace, just learning to walk, across the grass. The children's laughter mixed with adult conversation, creating the kind of moment that only matters when you have known its opposite. Mark stood with David at the grill, discussing market projections and innovation pipelines with the easy camaraderie of men who'd learned to trust through shared experience. Tom had driven up for the afternoon, his friendship with Mark having deepened into something approaching brotherhood despite the age difference. Elena and Victoria sat on the porch watching the children, their conversation moving between light gossip and deeper reflections on how dramatically life could change in the span of a single morning at a cemetery. Sometimes I still dream I'm in the casket. Victoria's admission came quiet. Wake up gasping, convinced I'm buried and no one's coming. Mark has nightmares too, that he arrived too late, that I wasn't there to stop him, that Sophie's death meant nothing. Elena's voice held understanding earned through 2 years of marriage to a man still learning to forgive himself. I think we're all haunted by what almost happened. But we're here despite the haunting. That has to count for something. Grace emerged from the kitchen with lemonade, surveying her extended family with the satisfaction of someone who'd orchestrated nothing but appreciated everything. She'd lost her niece briefly to death, then nearly lost her again to corporate machinations. But Victoria had survived both, and in surviving had built this, chosen family gathering in spring sunshine, children playing, adults finding peace in simple normalcy. Little Sophie stumbled and fell, the kind of minor tumble that precedes tears. But before the crying could start, a butterfly landed on her outstretched hand, bright orange and black, wings moving slowly as if considering whether to stay. Both children went still with wonder. Daniel crept closer, careful not to startle the creature. The adults watched in silence as the butterfly remained for a long moment, then lifted off to circle the garden before disappearing over the fence. Mark felt his throat tighten, memory and present colliding. Sophie had loved butterflies, drawn them constantly, chased them in their backyard with arms spread wide. Her last coherent words had been asking if the butterflies would come. And now, 17 years later, they were coming to the children who carried her memory forward. "Did you see that?" Daniel's voice carried pure amazement. "It landed right on her." Victoria's daughter looked at her hand with the kind of wonder that only children and those who face death can fully access. "Butterfly," she whispered, learning the word through experience. Elena moved to stand beside Mark, reading his expression with the intimacy of shared years. "She's watching over them, all of them." "I used to think that was just something people say to make themselves feel better about loss." Mark's voice came rough with emotion he'd learned to allow. "But moments like this make me wonder if maybe love really does transcend the grave. Love and the people brave enough to honor it." Lena leaned into him, offering the support that had never wavered through 2 years of marriage and all the years of friendship before. "You turned your love for Sophie into something that saves other children. That's not transcendence. That's transformation." The distinction mattered. Mark had spent a decade waiting for some sign that Sophie forgave him, that his failure could be absolved through suffering or penance. But Elena was right. The path forward wasn't about forgiveness, but transformation. Taking the love and grief and guilt and shaping them into something that served others. As afternoon stretched toward evening, the gathering settled into comfortable rhythms. Tom held Daniel while explaining how combustion engines worked, the boy listening with the fascinated incomprehension of a 2-year-old. David and Victoria swayed together to music only they could hear, their partnership having evolved from business collaboration into genuine love. Grace caught Mark's eye and gestured him over to where she sat beneath the garden's oak tree. At 70, she'd lost none of her sharpness, though time had softened some of her edges. "You've done well, Marcus. Better than I expected when I first researched you after the cemetery. You gave me the chance. You and Victoria both. We gave you opportunity. You provided the courage and competence." Grace studied him with the assessment of someone who'd learned to judge character through decades of Philadelphia society's masks. "Do you know what makes you remarkable? Not your expertise or your heroism. It's that you failed spectacularly and let that failure teach you instead of destroy you." The words carried wisdom Mark was only beginning to fully grasp. "I spent 10 years letting it destroy me. The teaching only started when I had to save Victoria." "No, the teaching started the day you chose to keep living despite wanting to die. The rest was just application." Grace's expression softened into something approaching affection. "Sophie would be proud, not just of the division or the lives saved, but of the man you've become through losing her." Mark nodded, unable to trust his voice. Grace patted his hand with grandmotherly warmth, then rose to help with dinner preparations, leaving him alone with thoughts that had grown gentler over time. The sun dropped toward the horizon, painting Philadelphia's skyline in gold and rose. Victoria called everyone to the table Grace had set in the garden, and they gathered, 8 adults, 2 children, a family forged through crisis and choice rather than blood. As they raised glasses in various toasts, to health, to love, to second chance, to the future, Mark caught Victoria's eye across the table. She smiled, and in that smile was everything they'd survived together. The casket and the poison, the trial and the corporate coup, the long rebuilding of lives shattered by violence and betrayal. They'd both been buried, she literally, he metaphorically, through grief and despair. But they'd both clawed their way back to light, and in doing so had helped each other find purpose beyond mere survival. The children grew restless as dinner concluded, Sophie demanding down from her high chair to toddle after fireflies beginning to emerge. Daniel followed, and the adults trailed behind, letting the evening's peace settle over them like benediction. Another butterfly appeared in the twilight, drawn by Grace's garden flowers. It circled the children, who watched with renewed wonder, then landed briefly on Mark's shoulder before flying off into the gathering dusk. "From ashes to dawn," Victoria whispered, watching the butterfly disappear. Every single time. Mark repeated the words like prayer, like promise, like the truth he had earned through falling and rising and refusing to stay buried. Every single time. And in the garden's dimming light, surrounded by people he loved and children who would never know the darkness that had almost consumed him, Marcus Donovan finally allowed himself to believe it. Not that the pain would ever fully vanish or that Sophie's absence would stop haunting him, but that life could be built from ruins, that love could survive burial, that dawn always came, even after the longest nights. The butterfly returned one final time, circling the gathered family before vanishing into spring's approaching darkness. And whether it carried Sophie's spirit or simply represented hope's persistence, Mark couldn't say. But he chose to believe in possibilities beyond death, in love that transcended loss, in the stubborn resilience of people who refuse to let tragedy write their final chapters. From ashes to dawn, always.